Hello everyone, investment scams rampant. Please vigilant and discerning. Do not trust information from unknown sources. Please make sure to recognize 2 official Capital Securities community, Facebook, Capital Securities, YouTube, Capital Wealth Insights.
Hello everyone, I'm Dong Jackson, Tony. Let's get started with today's group discussion. Good evening. First of all, we have 2 main topics today. Just by looking at these 2 topics, you can tell that today's outlook is still on the conservative side. We'll explain more in a bit. Even though there was some good news before the market opened, I want to make sure to talk to everyone about it. We still need to take a cautious approach when looking at this so-called good news that comes out after an unexpected risk event breaks out. When you're trying to figure out the direction, you really need to clarify things. Only then will you know whether this good news means you should increase your position and go for a strong rebound, or if you should use the rebound as an opportunity to adjust your holdings from a high point. All right, we'll talk about this in more detail in a bit. So first, let's talk about something that maybe no one has mentioned yet. It's a risk where you don't win. And of course, the second thing is the issue of PE ratios. Why is it that when a stock goes up a lot, its PE becomes high? Well, now there might be more pressure for a correction. So on Monday, I asked everyone, after this was killed off, after this blew up, and it still hasn't settled down yet, is this actually a good thing or a bad thing? Now, after a couple of days, if you look back, basically, in my own judgment, what I said that day was that it's actually a third option. This isn't a situation where things are getting worse because of interference, if you look at it later on. Isn't it clear now what this is all about? Okay, so let's take a look. Why do we need to be careful not to use the word win? Why did we even bring up the word win in the first place? Because Trump claims he's someone who wins a lot. The main thing is, just recently during the State of the Union address, which lasted almost 2 hours, he talked a lot about himself. The most famous thing he said was that he wins so much, some people have told him, please stop winning, you're winning too much, we're scared. And he replied, no, we're going to keep on winning. Trump likes to brag about his victories. He likes to crow about them. What we need to understand is that at its core, in American culture, there are no losers. The idea is, well, if you've ever heard of the phrase, winner takes all, you'll understand. Now, let's take another example. Biden. Why? Well, a lot of Americans like to make fun of him, and as we know, when you mock someone, it basically means you already see them as a weakling, someone who's not likely to win. So that's something we need to pay attention to here. That's why Trump loves to talk about his wins. But the problem is, it's exactly because he loves to win so much. Today, we want to talk to everyone about a certain situation. It's very possible that America could end up in a situation where there is no winner. So, why do I say that? Let me start with one reason. Why do I have this idea in the first place? First of all, this morning, as soon as I saw the news, it made me think of today's topic, no winner. Why? Because Trump said that in order to prevent, according to the law, using energy as a weapon, because Iran has already claimed that it will blockade the Strait of Hormuz, so ships in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea are basically just stopped on both sides, not daring to move. On Tuesday, Trump said that a U.S. company, the International Development Corporation, would provide insurance at a very reasonable price to make sure that ships can be insured to pass through the Persian Gulf. If necessary, the U.S. would use the Navy to start escorting them. But I want to make it clear to everyone, after I saw this, I realized that actually Trump is kind of all over the place, because this kind of statement seems more like a reaction to something. It's just a simple reaction to a sudden event. He doesn't seem to have any strategy or plan behind it. It's just like treating a headache when your head hurts, or treating your foot when your foot hurts. I think that's really bad. So why is it so bad? Let's take a look at the first reason. Trump said he wants to provide escorts, but this is like insurance. The ship owners say this is just a partial solution. The main point is, even if you can pay the insurance premium, let me ask you this. You can rebuild a ship if it breaks down or sinks, but what about the crew on board? That's human lives we're talking about, so under normal circumstances, this just isn't possible. If you want the crew to keep running this route, honestly, if you really ask the crew to go down and take this trip, a lot of them will just tell you, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. If you want to talk about compensation or anything else, we can discuss that later. At least if I'm alive, I can pay you back. If I'm gone, I can't compensate you. Celine's talk of insurance is just human nature. When you hear that, you just nod. Offering insurance, well, I just feel like, oh man, that's a terrible idea. That's not a good solution at all. The second option is providing an escort, so let's talk about that. Previously, in October 2023, it all started with that attack in Israel, the one involving Hamas. It wasn't in Samas, it was I forgot which side it was for a second. Oh, right, the Gaza Strip. So in this case, the Houthis, in order to show support for Hamas, ended up blockading the Red Sea. But we should note that this action continued all the way until November 11th, 2025, when the Houthis finally announced, all right, I'm done, I'm not doing this anymore. And this only happened after Operation Midnight Hammer, and after last year when Trump attacked Iran. Only after the subsequent agreement was this achieved. But first, let me talk to everyone about the first convoy escort operation. For convoy escort missions, you usually don't use aircraft carriers. You typically use destroyers or cruisers. As everyone knows, you don't send an aircraft carrier or a carrier strike group just to escort ships. That's not how it's done. Usually it's destroyers or frigates that handle escort duties. But the US military is now capable of doing this. As for past operations, the answer is no. Why? Because currently the US Navy only has 76 destroyers. 73 of them are Arleigh Burke class, and the other 3 are Zumwalt class. Why am I specifically mentioning the 3 Zumwalts? Because the Zumwalt class has already been discontinued, and has been proven to be a failed follow-up class. So now the US relies on those 73 Arleigh Burke class destroyers. That sounds like a lot. But you have to understand that the US military is deployed globally. If you concentrate too many ships in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, then who's going to handle patrols in other regions? That's a pretty big problem. Also, as for cruisers, there are only 7 Ticonderoga-class ships left. These are really old, and in principle, they're all supposed to be retired by around 2021 or 2022. So sending these old ships out on escort missions is actually pretty tough. What I want to point out is that when it comes to surface combat ships that can actually do escort duty, there are fewer options than you might think. And there's something even more important. Over the past 3 years, the US Navy has only launched a few Arleigh Burke-class ships. From the perspective of the last 3 years, that number really isn't much at all. All right, so here we need to mention that the pace at which they're building ships is such that in 3 years, they've only gotten up to hull number 43 or 44. And there's an even bigger issue that isn't written here. But when these warships experience some wear and tear or battle damage while on a mission, they have to return home for repairs. They can't be fixed overseas. According to U.S. law, combat ship repairs must be carried out at a shipyard located on the U.S. mainland, not just anywhere, but specifically within the United States itself. Only a shipyard can handle those repairs, and of course that includes places like Alaska or Hawaii. They can do repairs there, but neither of those places actually has a shipyard. Now, the main point I want to tell you is that they just don't have enough ships. And then the shipbuilding speed is just too slow. If the old ships need repairs, there's nowhere for them to go. So let me tell you, right now, the most valuable asset the U.S. Navy has is its existing fleet of ships. If you use the existing ships for so-called escort missions, well, that's basically what the Coast Guard does. If you send Navy warships to do that, it's really, really bad. The Navy's resources are already stretched thin. Maybe if they think outside the box, they could send Coast Guard ships over here. But what I want to tell you is, escorting is pretty much impossible. And let me remind you, don't forget this, Take the Red Sea, for example. Compared to the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea is narrower and longer. But the Persian Gulf isn't exactly wide either. It's also a very narrow body of water. If you send warships into this area, they're basically right in the middle of Iran's strike range, completely covered by Iranian firepower. Now, what we especially need to point out is this. How does it cover the area? Because the waterway isn't wide, you can see that Iran doesn't even need missiles to cover it. They can use long-range rockets, and they don't even have to be precise. They just need to fire at a certain density, blanket the area, and there's nowhere for you to escape. So what I'm saying is, if you really try to provide escort in this situation, it's actually extremely difficult. And just to remind everyone, do you remember, I forget if it was the USS Truman or another ship, but there was one in the Red Sea. To dodge incoming missiles, it made a sharp turn, a big maneuver, and ended up throwing two FA-18 Super Hornet fighter jets right off the deck and into the sea. So those two jets just sank to the bottom of the ocean like that. Each one costs, what, over $100 million or something? Anyway, they're really expensive. It was all because of dodging missiles. One sharp turn, one tail swing to evade the missile, and this kind of thing has already happened before. So let me tell you, this so-called escorting sounds great, right? It feels awesome, like there's nothing to worry about. But I'm telling you, actually, might not even be possible. And another thing, why am I telling you all this? Actually, let's take a look at this. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz isn't the cause. It's actually the result, not the reason. Why is that? The main point is, why do I say it's a result and not a cause? It's mainly because Iran hasn't collapsed yet, and it hasn't lost its ability to fight. It's still fighting. That's why Iran still has the ability to say, I'm going to block the Strait of Hormuz, and people actually believe they can pull it off. So, a few points here. Here's some indicators that show you Iran hasn't collapsed or fallen into chaos. First of all, the assassination was indeed a success. Very successful, in fact. So successful that, Trump believed, like we mentioned yesterday, he thought that everyone who could come forward to negotiate had already been killed by them. By the way, let me tell you a joke. Well, it's not really a joke. It's actually true. Right now, nobody knows where Iran's enriched uranium has gone, and the answer is the same as before. Everyone who knew is already dead. Ah, that joke was pretty cold, huh? Anyway, the most important thing now is that Iran's counterattacks have become relentless. The market believes that because their counterattacks are ongoing, they have the capability to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. Also, let me just mention something else here. If what you see or feel is that Iran is already finished and things are just kind of over for them, based on some of the news reported by certain media outlets, if that's the case, then I suggest you'd better not get involved in the international stock market, because the international stock market might end up facing real changes in the international political and economic landscape, which is actually quite different from what you see in Chinese language media. That's all I can say about that. Secondly, let me give you an example showing that Iran hasn't collapsed and there's no panic or chaos. There hasn't been a wave of people fleeing around, and there aren't any refugees coming out of Iran. Now, compare that to the early days of the Russia-Ukraine war. As soon as the war broke out, you saw a huge wave of Ukrainian refugees pouring out. They fled in all directions, to Poland, to Romania. Basically, people near the Polish border ran to Poland. Those near the Romanian border ran to Romania. And those near the Russian border even fled to Russia. But in Iran's case, there hasn't been any such wave of people fleeing. On the contrary, what you actually see is a surge in their fighting spirit. All right, so maybe you saw that when Khamenei died, there were people celebrating in the streets. But what you might not have seen is that right after that, there were hundreds of thousands, some even say over 1 million people. Okay, maybe not 1 million, but definitely hundreds of thousands. They went out to the streets to mourn and pay their respects. The leader of the Shia faction is still strong, so what I'm telling you is that when you attack like this, it actually rallies his base even more. And then Iran's new leader has also emerged, and it's still Khamenei. Why did his son take over? Well, sorry, but think about it. If someone blew up your dad and you came to power after that, do you think you'd be a moderate? Would you be willing to take a gamble? That's kind of tough, right? Here, we also need to mention a case where being careful didn't lead to a win. This is from a United Daily News report. They used a piece of international news from the New York Times. U.S. Secretary of State Rubio, he said, we need to unleash Chiang Kai-shek, basically bring him out. So what was the intention behind that? It was to use, during the Cold War, to arm Chiang Kai-shek so he could fight the communists. It was basically used as a rallying slogan. Now let me tell everyone this. Let me start with one thing. So Chiang Kai-shek's advantage at the time was mainly in his equipment and the vast resources he controlled. He had a lot of money too, but his power was mostly concentrated in the cities, and of course, Mao Zedong took advantage of that, encircling the cities from the countryside and then eventually winning. So you have to realize that Iran's situation is pretty similar. Sure, you see some pro-Western groups in the cities now, but the thing is, the rural base is, in principle, made up of fundamentalists. So it's basically a similar background to the one between the nationalists and communists back then. We need to mention Rubio's point here. The biggest issue is that this time, America's opponent isn't an ideological enemy. It's not the so-called confrontation between communism and liberal democracy. Instead, it's a religious enemy. This kind of enemy is a religion that's even stronger than ideology. It's a form of ideology that's even more powerful, and it comes with its own doctrines. Plus, you have to realize that Iran's theocratic tradition has lasted for over 1,000 years. If you're trying to use a few hundred years to go up against 1,000 years, in principle, that's just not going to work. Okay, another thing I want to tell everyone is, so what I want to say is, here's another example to show you. Have you heard a certain rumor? So there's talk that the U.S. wants to incite the Kurdish armed forces in Iran to start an uprising and launch a ground offensive. But first, let's clarify something. The Kurds make up about 10% of Iran's population, just so you know. The Kurdish population is primarily situated in the western regions, while the Baloch people are located far to the east, right along the rugged borders shared with Pakistan. Both of these minority groups have a tendency towards separatism, but the thing is, their numbers and capabilities just aren't enough. Also, I want to clarify something about Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijanis living in Iran, the Iranian Azerbaijanis, and the country of Azerbaijan, well, even though there's a country called Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijanis within Iran don't actually have separatist tendencies. Why is that? Because in Iran, religion comes before ethnicity. So as long as they share the same religion, that's what matters most. So that's not really an issue. Another reason for this is that there's an important Islamic shrine, the Qom Mosque, which is located in Iran, but that area is part of the Azerbaijani region. I'm just sharing what I know. So given this situation, Azerbaijanis in Iran don't feel like they're not Iranian. It's not that just because someone isn't Persian, they feel like they're not Iranian. On the flip side, Persians don't think that way either. So, as I was saying, the main ethnic group is Persian, followed by Azerbaijanis, who make up about 20 to 20-something%. When you add those two together, you're left with about 10 to 15% for the rest. Won't have any effect at all. And then there's another natural enemy of the Kurds. Well, not exactly a natural enemy, but someone who always reacts whenever the Kurds are involved, and that's Erdogan. Turkey over here will get involved. So if you look at the Iranian protests at the beginning of last month, actually, afterward, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran all closed their borders at the same time, specifically targeting the Kurds who were trying to cross. For those trying to get into Iran to stir up trouble, what they did was basically shut the door and trap them like a dog in a cage. So what I want to tell everyone is that trying to do this is extremely difficult. And also, relying on these methods, so these foreign elements want to try to regain power through armed struggle. But this process is really slow. It's likely to be so slow that the US military might even step in directly. So let me tell everyone something. If you're thinking about using someone else to do your dirty work, that's not going to be easy either. And besides, people have already started talking about this. In fact, my colleagues and I were already discussing it yesterday and the day before. Actually, for Iran, for them, Iran knows it's not going to win. They're fully aware of that. So if you know you can't win, what does winning even mean for you? Winning for you just means not losing. That's pretty deep, right? Let me remind you again, Iran is never going to beat the United States. Everyone knows that. So since you're in a situation where you can't win, how do you achieve a win? It's by making sure you don't lose. And you can see that here. The New York Times has also done some analysis on this, saying what Iran hopes for is to make things unbearable for the United States. For example, if the war becomes too costly, too many casualties, skyrocketing energy costs, inflation pressures, then Trump might have to pull back or pause the attacks. In this case, just surviving would be considered a victory, even if it's a Pyrrhic one. This is the idea behind an asymmetric war of attrition. They're holding back, waiting to further escalate when Israel, the US, and the Gulf states' air defense systems are stretched to their limits. That's their strategy, like I mentioned before. Now, let me explain one of Iran's initial goals, because Trump said he was going to bomb the surrounding areas. All right, as long as Iran can hold out for 4 weeks, and at the same time maintain the capability to launch a missile at any time, just one missile hitting Israel, that's considered a success. Think about it. When Trump is about to hold a press conference claiming he's being sincere with Iran, and then within half an hour, a missile is launched from inside Iran and lands anywhere in Israel, whether it's a hypersonic missile or a cruise missile, as long as it hits the ground, there will be sparks flying. It doesn't even have to cause casualties. As long as there's property damage, it proves that the strikes by the US and Israel against Iran haven't succeeded. That means they'll have no choice but to keep getting bogged down in the Iranian theater. For Israel, well, for Iran, that's what success looks like. As for Trump, his definition of success is pretty broad. We can talk more about that later, I'm telling you. When it comes to what Trump wants to achieve, Iran's goal is actually pretty simple and straightforward. Basically, Iran has already let go of its power, so that's the situation here. In fact, Iran is actually more likely to achieve its so-called strategic goals than Trump, the US, or Israel. This is a situation where Iran hasn't lost, and when Iran hasn't lost, it also reflects a situation where Trump hasn't won. So I want to remind everyone, be especially careful about this. Will this war turn into a ground war or even escalate into a war of attrition? Right now, it's still too early to tell. The main thing is, let's first look at the situation in the coming weeks, specifically what happens in the 3rd and 4th weeks. Actually, if there's a rebound, you probably shouldn't get too excited and chase after it. Instead, you should think carefully about whether you really want to act. It's better to adjust your position rather than blindly chasing because of this. Even if things settle down, the next few weeks could still be a period of high optimism and expectations. Why am I telling you this? It's easy to start a war, but it's very hard to end one. It's really hard, right? If you don't believe me, just think of a name. Vladimir Putin. When he was dealing with Ukraine, didn't they talk about a blitzkrieg and surrounding the enemy at first? But look, it's been 4 years and they're still negotiating. So let me just say this again. Really, war is a matter of utmost importance for a country. You have to be extremely cautious. Now, let's take a look at crude oil. The not so great news is that it continued to rise for a second week. But the good news is, when I checked this afternoon, the candlestick for the price increase was really big, but now it's come back down. Why is that? Here's some good news I can share with everyone. There are reports in the market that Iran has reached out through intermediaries to seek a ceasefire. This news has made the market a bit more optimistic, but I also want to remind everyone, whether it's from official channels or not, a lot of this is just people trying to fool each other. So don't take this kind of news too seriously, because it's very possible that the news actually things might not go as smoothly as you think. Also, there's another move from Iran right now. So on the first day, their leaders could be targeted for assassination. They're already very clear about Israel's plan, which is to go for decapitation strikes. So since you want to decapitate me, I'll just delegate my power. And actually, Iran has delegated power very thoroughly, almost completely. It's kind of like if you use the late Qing dynasty as an analogy, the imperial court was basically finished. So it's like how power was delegated to the governors of Liangguang, Lianghu, and so on. Each province basically ran its own affairs. So now local armed forces have the authority to make their own decisions, whether that's launching attacks, using force, or maintaining local administration. They have official power to do so. So this situation is really complicated, and it also leads to the possibility that some people might, on the US side, they want to express a willingness to negotiate, but the problem is, which person are they supposed to negotiate with? A controls this area, B controls that area, and what about C? So things get really complicated like this, which is why I think this is a scenario that's likely to drag on for a while. Also, there's another thing. There have been some rumors coming out of Qatar. They've suspended the production of some chemical products and metals. Basically, after their liquefied natural gas facilities were attacked, they started shutting down production. We need to understand this. Natural gas and crude oil are usually developed together, and when natural gas is extracted, there's a byproduct called ammonia, a type of gaseous ammonia. If I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I studied chemistry, ammonia is used to make urea, and urea can be used to produce chemical fertilizers. So what this is telling you is that once production stops, chemical fertilizer production also stops. Now it's March, right? So when it's time to fertilize, there might be a shortage of fertilizer. So everyone should pay attention to this. There are definitely side effects to this, but what's really bad is that the impact is really spreading and expanding. Yesterday, both gold and silver prices dropped quite a bit, but today they've both rebounded. Yesterday, the US dollar was too strong, so they were a bit squeezed. Now that there's been a rebound, I think there's no need to get too anxious about this drop in gold prices. It's understandable to get nervous when there's a big drop, because most gold investments involve futures, which are leveraged. So it's only natural to feel nervous, and that's totally understandable. The same goes for silver prices. After dropping sharply yesterday and the day before, they've stabilized and rebounded today. As for the US dollar index, today it turned downward. So regarding the 2-year and 10-year yields, as we've mentioned before, in this round, neither the 2-year nor the 10-year has really served as a safe haven. The main concern is inflation and also the fiscal deficit. So compared to the previous 2 days, things were more pessimistic, but today people have calmed down a bit. Of course, we'll still have to see what happens next. Let's talk about this first. Yesterday, I mentioned this in the morning, there was a news article written about it. Investors were selling off global bonds. Why? Because the Middle East crisis has intensified and there's growing concern about inflation. Why? Because oil prices are rising, and now we're seeing this affect things like fertilizers and so on. Some chemical raw materials are also in short supply and production has stopped. This is pushing inflation even higher, and as inflation rises, people get more anxious. Basically, everyone is worried about the outlook for interest rates, so this is a relatively tense situation. So everyone is making adjustments accordingly. All right, so we especially want to make this clear to everyone here. Let's list this out and take a look at the price-to-earnings ratios of the major countries. Of course, we'll focus mainly on US stocks here. Looking at the Dow Jones, its current PE ratio is 24.31, and the 10-year average is 20.3. So even though the estimated P/E for 2027 looks very low, why is that? 21.69, 18.95, it's because you're expecting earnings to grow. So that's why. If the price stays the same and earnings grow, then the P/E ratio will naturally go down. Of course, that's a more optimistic scenario. Now, let's keep going and finish looking at the US markets. The S&P 500 currently has a P/E ratio of 26.8, with a 10-year average of 22.53. The projections for the following years are 21.86 and 19.5, which look pretty good. The Nasdaq is also relatively high at 38.46, and its 10-year average is 39.27. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index is at 50.24, with a 10-year average of 30.63. So you can see that the PE ratio for the semiconductor sector is actually quite high, but there's something important we need to point out here. You need to pay attention. Now that corrections are starting, once interest rates go up, well, the inverse of the PE ratio is the earnings yield. Or rather, the inverse of the PE ratio is the earnings yield, right? So you'll want to make comparisons. That's what we want to point out to everyone here. Be careful. If there's going to be a major correction, it's true that Iran is a factor, but what actually drops is the PE ratio. So pay attention. The pressure to correct is going to be greater for high PE stocks. We're talking about individual high PE stocks or sectors, and the overall market will face more correction pressure. So you need to be cautious if there's a rebound. You need to decide which side to adjust on, which direction to take. So I encourage everyone to evaluate that for themselves. Actually, the answer should be pretty obvious, right? Because why is that? The war isn't going to end that soon, right? And you don't know if it's going to drag on for a long time or if prices will start to creep up. But the thing is, like we mentioned on Monday, aside from this, when the market dropped sharply on Monday, we talked about a few reasons. First, tech stocks keep getting squeezed, and even after Nvidia's great earnings report, the stock didn't go up. The second reason is the issue with the recent cockroach problem, right? And then there's also the issue of AI putting pressure on the market. The third reason is the suspicion that the PPI is too high. These were the reasons we talked about on Monday for last Friday's correction in the US stock market. Now today, let's talk about something else and give you some data. Let's take a look at the PE ratio. If there's a significant correction now, the PE ratio will adjust. And when it does, please don't expect it to end too quickly. This adjustment could last a bit longer, possibly several weeks. There's definitely a possibility of that. Also, due to time constraints, let's just focus on Taiwan for now. Currently, Taiwan's price to earnings ratio it's 29.25. Of course, the 10-year average is much lower, mainly because TSMC's value has only really emerged in the past 2 or 3 years. But I want to point something out. Even with TSMC's value, or other semiconductor stocks have value too, but in the short term, they've also gone up a lot. So you need to be careful. After a big rally, there's always pressure for a correction. Okay, just like before, we want to remind everyone to pay attention to this. And then this is another trend chart. This is the daily chart, so it's a bit different from the numbers we saw earlier. Okay, but if you calculate it day by day and compare it to the numbers that research institutions have recalculated, it's not the same. Here it's 26.22, and the 3-year average is 24.55. So roughly 26.6 versus 24.5. So what this tells you is that, at least compared to the 3-year average, there's still some value here. There's still some room for adjustment. Of course, if you compare it to the 10-year average, it's even lower. So what I want to tell everyone is pay attention to the situation with this PE ratio adjustment. Especially, as we've mentioned, if you look at the past 3 years, actually, if you look back over the past 5 or 10 years, it's the same story. Corrections in the PE ratio usually come along with corrections in stock prices, so that's something everyone needs to pay more attention to. Having a high PE ratio isn't necessarily a problem, but when it starts to correct, that's when the pressure really builds up. Now, there's another point to consider, which is the opposite side of things, EPS growth rate, or profit growth. As I've mentioned before, if you look back over the years, up to 2016 or 2017, you'll actually see that for the resources and technology sector, this particular group, this sub-index, you'll notice that their revenue growth peaked in Q2, and then after that, it started to turn and gradually decline. Of course, the reason for this is that the base in 2025 is relatively high, so after you pass the inflection point with a higher base, growth naturally slows down. This is a challenge that the sector was always going to face. However, during this slowdown process, now you're running into a few issues with AI-related positives. For example, there's uncertainty about AI spending, and AI might have some side effects. People are noticing the downsides before they see the benefits. Also, there are concerns about financial stocks, and only luxury goods still have some momentum. On top of that, if you look at the PE ratio and oil prices are starting to rise, it could affect inflation expectations. So what I want to say here is that you still need to be careful. Don't just see a beautiful EPS growth and assume everything is solid. That's not necessarily the case. Sometimes you really need to take a step back and carefully evaluate before making a decision. Whether you should jump in or take some other kind of action, you need to think it through. So just take this as a reference. Let me quickly mention there weren't any major economic data releases last night, but there will be some tonight. Tonight, we have the ADP employment numbers, which are okay, but the main thing right now is On Thursdays, we already have the initial jobless claims numbers, so aside from the monthly ADP report, that's usually the more important one. Wait, actually, this should be... So tonight's ADP is the so-called mini non-farm payrolls, not the weekly one. Sorry, let me correct myself. What I just mentioned was the weekly one, which doesn't get as much attention. But if it's the ADP, you should know that the expectation is for an increase from 22,000 up to 50,000. So when you look at this translation, the expected increase actually means the outlook is still on the weak side. If it's not 80 to 100,000, it's considered weak. That's something pretty significant to pay attention to. And another thing, as for the S&P PMI final reading, we can just use it as a reference because Americans still mainly look at the older, more established ISM index. So pay attention to this. The expected value for the services sector is dropping from 58.5 or 53.8 down to 53.5. That's a decline. What's more important, and let me point this out to everyone, is that it's talking about output. The method for measuring output is fine, but I think the real focus in the services sector is elsewhere. It's not about employment, and it's not about new orders. The key point is prices paid. Why? Because the ISM manufacturing index that came out on Monday showed a slowdown. Even though it was higher than expected, it still slowed down, but there was something not so good about it. One of the main reasons it was pushed up was because the price index was relatively high. So today, we also need to look at the services sector to see if prices paid are following the same trend, whether it moves from the expected 66.6 up to 68.3. Even if the market doesn't immediately react to these prices paid, if this signals an expectation of rising prices, once it shows up in consumer prices, it will lead to something. Later, we'll also mention comments from Federal Reserve officials about this. So, for example, the room for rate cuts this year might not reach 4 times. It might only be around 2. That's why I've been reminding everyone about this on the show. And then yesterday, in one of the earnings reports released before the market opened, Best Buy, which is the big 3C electronics retailer in the US, actually performed pretty well. Their outlook was relatively weak, but even though it was weak, it was better than feared, better than people were worried about, better than expected, so the stock price went up by 7.08%. One of the key highlights in there is Tidewater. This is actually a pretty strong player in the market. This company operates offshore energy resource vessels because with offshore oil rigs, you always need some supply runs to bring materials or to do special maintenance and such. Tidewater is the company that does this kind of work. Their revenue and profits have been very strong, and they've even raised their revenue guidance for this fiscal year. So it shot up by 9.77%. Now, let me tell everyone, again, let me lay out my thought process for you all just like before. The groups that are more likely to perform well right now are all shifting toward the energy sector. Power generation, defense industry, all these so-called heavy asset sectors that people talk about, but I wouldn't really describe them that way. I think it's more about industries with strong fundamental demand showing good performance. So that's one good trend. Now, let's take a look at Progressive Insurance. Progressive, the auto insurance company. This one's a small cap. Then there's AutoZone, which didn't do so well. They said their performance was affected by winter storms, so their stock dropped on Tuesday. But the thing is, from my experience working in the US, I don't really know. You see, in New York City, we don't really need to drive. But in places where people generally have to drive, when there's a winter snowstorm, that's actually a good season for car repairs. Why? Because people always end up bumping their headlights or scraping something here and there. You might need to get a minor repair or fix it yourself, and that means buying parts. So it should actually be good for business, but their results weren't great. Anyway, moving on. Target, on the other hand, performed better than expected. The company also announced that it's profitable again, saying it's gotten through the worst. The new CEO is actually an activist investor who came in to push for reforms. Of course, during yesterday's earnings call, they announced a new reform plan, which is why the stock price went up. But it's just that if, say, a war breaks out between the US and Iran and oil prices surge, that would still be a headwind for the retail industry. So it might be better to take a wait-and-see approach for now. As for department stores and apparel discount stores, well, there's Their performance has been pretty good, better than expected actually, and their outlook also beat expectations, so the stock went up after hours. Now, as for GitLab, that's a software company, and its stock has been a bit more volatile. That's because software companies have been relatively weak lately. Even CrowdStrike, which is more well-known, has been affected. So if you look at GitLab, GitLab isn't quite as big, but CrowdStrike, on the other hand, played a key role when Microsoft's major on-premises servers went down before. CrowdStrike is actually an important company providing services for Microsoft's cloud services. So what they're saying here is pretty good. It's a good company to invest in, and it's also a good place to live with strong growth prospects. But the stock price is still fluctuating. After the volatility, it basically closed flat. As for GitHub, it was more volatile, and for most of the after-hours trading, it was actually dropping. So yeah, this cross drive is still pretty volatile, both up and down. The ups and downs are pretty much on point. Okay, so that's for Tuesday. Now for Wednesday, tonight, before the market opens, there's MF, which is a trendy brand. You know, the one with models, like the modeling brand. The one with male models, that company, they're going to announce their earnings. Also, there's Bath & Body Works, the company that's famous for its strong fragrances. And then there's another one, BF, which people aren't as familiar with, but the strongest brand is Jack Daniel's, that bourbon whiskey. They're also going to announce their earnings, but the most important focus is still on the after-hour session. Of course, the ones we've picked out here are the more significant ones. AEO, which is American Eagle, will also be releasing their earnings. Viva, the software company, will announce their earnings too, and Okta, another software company, will also report. Recently, software companies announcing earnings have, more often than not performed very well. It's still the pressure from AI squeezing them that's really intense. Also, the most important thing tonight, and something we'll also talk about tomorrow, is Broadcom. How are Broadcom's earnings? Are they good or not? We're a bit pressed for time today, so I didn't get a chance to include Broadcom's individual stock performance, but honestly, if you look at Broadcom's chart, it's not particularly optimistic. Just putting that out there first. Also, after hours today, another company will announce, GTI Ricket. This is a quantum computing company, but they don't have any products yet, so as you might expect, they're usually operating at a loss, okay? So that's something to keep in mind with their earnings report. After we finish watching the Fed's press conference, we'll take a look at the market together. How could you? Yesterday, there were 3 or 4 people who spoke. First, Vice Chair Bobman said that they need to review the effectiveness of liquidity rules and emphasize the bank's ability to withstand stress. Basically, his stance is more moderate, so the general expectation is that there might be a chance for some easing after this explanation. Okay, and then looking at Citi, Chairman Schmidt said that inflation is still too high, but he also said that the labor market is relatively balanced, so he still maintains a more conservative stance. And then in New York, Valance, he said that whether the proprietary trading desk will cut rates further depends on the progress of inflation. At first glance, the headline might seem a bit negative, but actually, if you look further, he added something. He said, this part is pretty important. It means that tariffs have had some additional impact on the CPI in the first half of this year, basically pushing it up. But after that, the inflation rate is expected to start coming down, with a target of dropping to 2.5% by the end of this year, and then down to 2% next year. So then it also says that in recent months this year, there have been encouraging signs of stabilization in the labor force. Okay, so here I'm still mainly concerned about inflation. It looks like the expectation for a rate cut has just been pushed back, which is actually good news. It hasn't disappeared. But the key point is, it's true that the rate cut is being postponed, but at the same time, you also see the situation between Israel and Iran. This really needs to be handled quickly, otherwise the trouble could get a lot bigger. Neil Kashkari from Minnesota said that the situation in Iran has added uncertainty, and right now it's too early to assess the impact on inflation. Also, there's a possibility that because of this, it could become staying on hold is more likely. He also mentioned that cutting rates by 1/4 to 1/2 percentage point later this year might be appropriate. So in other words, they're not really closing the door on rate cuts. It's just that if you're hoping for the kind of big rate cuts that Trump talked about, well, you might have to wait a bit longer. There's also another comment from someone watching this, and it's also about inflation. Actually, it's not just the 3 or 4 people who spoke yesterday. There have been others, one after another, who have mentioned inflation and talked about this. Every week, someone brings up how the US-Iran conflict is putting upward pressure on inflation. So there have already been ongoing news reports about this from those watching the situation. I think they will cut interest rates, but the rate cut probably won't be that big. As for OpenAI, take a look at that. Another big piece of news, in my opinion, is Iran, but that's not the only thing. What's strange is that French President Macron said he's going to send their flagship, the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, to the Eastern Mediterranean. Let me tell you, this is interesting. I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second. If I turn out to be right, don't think I'm being too pessimistic, okay? First of all, hitting a warship with a missile isn't as easy as you might think. But if even the Houthis can hit and get close to American warships, then maybe it's not that hard after all. To a large extent, these countries or organizations all know that attacking the US military carries a pretty big risk. But France, now that's an interesting loophole. If the Charles de Gaulle goes to the Mediterranean and then accidentally gets caught by Iran, now that would be really interesting. But do you think Trump would stand up for France? So if something happens to France and the US doesn't step in, what will they do? Well, honestly, let's just wait and see. Personally, when I saw this news, I thought Macron must be too full. He always does this, just making statements to condemn things. That's probably enough, right? If you want to make your presence felt and just get through today, you better be careful not to get caught. All right, now let's take a quick look at the market. Today, we only have the stock index chart, so we'll spend some time in a bit on the pre-market performance. And if anyone is interested in any particular stocks, if I see someone mention them, I'll talk about them directly with you. Let's do a direct line chart review. So looking at the S&P here, it basically went down this week. There's a wick left, but I want to point out that the wick is pretty long. It's on the S&P, but you might not see the same thing on other indexes. That's because of the weighting. For the broader market, there's also a long wick, but you should know that the candlestick itself is even longer, with a drop of 1.23%. And here, it only dropped 1.02%. You can see that the resistance is actually, well, the highs keep getting lower and the lows keep getting lower too, which is pretty bad, even though the 200-day moving average is coming up and there might be a rebound. There's still resistance above. Yeah, so when the moving averages press down, the resistance might be, basically it's a test to see whether the short-term downward pressure is stronger, or if the support from the long-term upward moving average is stronger. So also, the Magnificent 7 index touched the 200-day moving average the day before yesterday, left a shadow, and today it left another shadow. If you look back, there was finally a shadow left in February, but I want to tell everyone, if it touches 3 times, in principle, it should break through. You can check individual stocks later. Oh, sorry, we do not have that today, but we will tomorrow if there is one. If you look at the candlestick charts for individual stocks, you won't feel too optimistic. As for the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, it was really rough yesterday. Let me specifically mention, yesterday in the Philly Semiconductor Index, there wasn't anyone leading the gains, but the one that dropped the most was Credo. I remember this one announced its earnings report this week. I think it was released earlier in the week. It dropped quite a bit, almost 15%. Rambus, this one is mainly related to memory, but its technology is a bit outdated. It's memory, from earlier generations. Let's put it that way. Actually, it's memory from a few generations back in terms of technology. Here, it dropped 4.58%. Wait, no, it dropped 11.42%. So be especially careful. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index was performing pretty strongly before, but now it's starting to correct. So be careful and make sure to hedge properly. Now let's take a look at the futures and switch over to Bloomberg to check its performance. Whoa. Alright, there's been a turnaround, and it seems like the market is seeing some hope for peace here. But I want to remind everyone again, don't get your hopes up too much. Remember during the Russia-Ukraine war, it was the same thing. Peace talks back and forth over and over again, and in the end, it just keeps going back and forth, and even now it's still repeating itself. So I don't think this will end so quickly. You don't see any real signs of a ceasefire atmosphere yet. If they really do just stop now, just pick any random time and use any excuse to stop, then it would definitely be because of Trump. And, well, maybe he'll take credit for it, since he always likes to take credit anyway. Now, looking over here, there's some good news today. In Panjin, I see some good news. There's some positive news for certain stocks. I think this is about MRMA over here. This he paid to settle I think it was some kind of legal lawsuit, basically a dispute that he went ahead and settled, reached a settlement. Then Rustore is reflecting that in their financial report. And as for Coinbase, and it also went up. Let me scroll through real quick. As for Jushong, like I just mentioned, it performed better than expected. Jack Daniel did well, so its stock went up. And then Robinhood also went up. Then looking at SCNK, it dropped a lot yesterday, but today it rebounded. That's good news. It means it's not just weak and dropping nonstop, but I'm not going to get too excited. Why? Honestly, all the memory-related stocks have gone up too much in the short term. There's nothing wrong with the company and the outlook is fine, but when stocks go up too much in the short term, that becomes a problem, so there's always a chance for a correction, right? Also, Micron rebounded too. Gold prices and the stock price of Newmont, the gold company, also bounced back. This is a new software called Unity, okay? And then Corning Glass also rebounded, as you can see here. Pretty much the top 20 stocks all rebounded, with more than a 1% drop before. Let's take a look here. Things look a bit better here, not quite 20, around the 15th spot or so. There aren't any stocks that dropped more than 1%, right? And then Las Vegas Sands is among those that fell. It's a pullback from the highs, and that's probably related to the news about possible peace talks. But let me tell you, honestly, I think it's pretty unlikely, because last time during the peace talks, you tilled people halfway through, so I really wonder who you can even get to the table this time. Anyway, let's just wait and see how things play out. Looking at energy stocks, you can see that most of the declines are actually in the energy sector, which is still pretty much a given. So today, it looks like there might be a rebound. I think there's a chance for a bounce today, and it probably won't be a situation where everything just keeps crashing. First off, you can see oil prices have dropped, so there might actually be some better news coming out. And then, on the other hand, also, US Treasury yields have come down this month. Alright, and then the 10-year Treasury is also trending down, and the S&P mini futures are showing a slight uptick. But I still want to remind everyone here, it's still rough. It's not looking good. It needs a big bullish candle to pull back up. 2 or 3 more are needed to trend up, but one bearish candle could end it. It's pretty clear which side the risk-reward is leaning toward. Like I just mentioned, British intelligence officials have insisted that the US is seeking to end the conflict, right? That's basically the main reason for today's shift. Now, let's take a look at everyone's questions. Alright, let's look at the night session rebound. Crude oil started to turn down. Yeah, Bitcoin had a surge and a rebound, and then people wanted to buy the dip, I'm telling you. I think everyone needs to be aware of this kind of situation. At most, it's just a rebound play. Memory stocks won't really do that because actually, they're actually a great target for quick short-term trades. All right. If the US withdraws its troops, I think that's actually the best outcome. Even though it might look bad on the surface, in reality, it helps preserve more of their interests. The increase in medical support is just a stopgap. I feel like this conflict could drag on for a long time. Yeah, because with Iran fighting up to this point, I think they're kind of ready to go all out, like a do-or-die situation. Actually, let me explain this to everyone. You still need to pay attention to this war. It has its own logic, and things can change very quickly. To be precise, things can go bad really fast. Right now, it looks like the US might have a chance to pull back, but it's also possible that within 2 or 3 weeks, they'll end up having to send in troops after all. All of these are possible. Until they fully pull back, you can't rule out these risks, so please pay attention. Some people say Iran only has a few bombs left to use. Sure, but the problem is you don't know how many they actually have left. What if they still have hundreds or even thousands? Then what? Will the Navy's specialized materials be affected? No, let me tell you, these specialized materials are produced in relatively small quantities and their purity should be fine. Now, it's true that there could be some impact, so let's talk about that first. But there are other sources and refineries, and the raw materials aren't only from the Middle East. It's just that, it might affect the supplies circulating in the market. There will be about a 10% decrease, and it'll be much harder to source these materials. But for companies like TSMC, there really isn't much of a problem. Their supply chain management is pretty solid, yeah. A friend mentioned not to use leverage to stay safe. Let me tell you about something from Twitter. Charlie Munger, the late partner of Buffett, he once said, a man can lose everything because of 3 L's. They cloud your judgment and can lead to bankruptcy. So what are the 3? 1 is liquor, 1 is lady, and the 3rd is leverage. Liquor means alcohol. Lady, well, he actually used the plural, so it means women, basically living a wild lifestyle. And the 3rd is using leverage. So according to him, everyone should... You can just take this as something to listen to. I think some of these sayings are really useful. Back in the day, things like Columbia University were out of our reach. And earlier, I mentioned that today they're going to release their financial report. Let's hope for the best. I really hope things go well, but honestly, it's going to be tough. If France gets dragged into this, it really will never end. I don't know. Sigh. I think you can see that the French military isn't that weak, but the French people are kind of weak. You don't really know the French, huh? Anyway, whatever. All right, then. Yeah, going to help the US fight Iran is definitely a challenge, of course. So yeah, the French really care about saving face. Now, everyone, AB mentioned AVA, right? Let me tell you, let's just take a direct look at AVA. Since we're doing this live, we have to make it feel a little different, Also, let me ask, there's another one, this thing called Around Us. Hey, did you see why it dropped so much yesterday? Let me tell you, first of all, the US military's current operations are still mainly traditional. Drones are just a supplement. This is different from the Russia-Ukraine battlefield, where drones are the main force. Second, hey, this still involves the issue of product capability, If ONDs is also dropping, that means they're not seeing any gains in this area. This could be more related to the specific situation of individual companies. There's a shadow left on the chart, but it didn't close down, This could be an impact specific to individual companies, so you might need to gather a bit more news. All right, that's about it. If there aren't any other questions, then that's it for today's live stream. See you all tomorrow.
Our company has no improper financial interests in the individual securities recommended or analyzed. The information in this program is for reference only. Investors should make independent judgments, evaluate carefully, and bear their own investment risks. If you don't want to miss the latest market updates, be sure to turn on the notification bell and hit subscribe. In addition, we have plenty of great video content on both Facebook and YouTube. Don't miss out. In our group, we share in-depth explanations of global financial events with you every day.